This book explores the implication of one of the most surprising discoveries in recent neuroscience, which is the overwhelming evidence that most of what our brain does, maybe 95%, is unconscious. The main point I really want listeners to understand is the idea that there's stuff going on that you actually can't get to and you can't control it. Feeling like you know stuff is rewarding, right? And there seem to be some people who, the know-it-alls, the people that always have to be right.
Are you talking about medical doctors, Ginger, or what?
Well, I'm sure that there's a high frequency of that personality trait.
This is Brain Inspired.
Hello, good people. This is Paul Middlebrooks. If you listen to Brain Inspired, you likely listen to, or at least have listened to, Brain Science, Ginger Campbell's podcast. She's been producing Brain Science for 14 years now, and she and her podcast have inspired me and educated me for a long time. I have multiple distinct memories of listening to her podcast while I was on a run in various places that I've lived. Ginger is releasing a second edition of her book, Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty, in which she summarizes a lot of key ideas from Richard Burton, who's written a couple books on the subject and appeared on her show a few times. Most of those ideas center around how the vast majority of our brain processing is of the unconscious variety, and how our conscious feeling of confidence about anything originates from that unconscious processing. And we should think of the feeling of knowing, that feeling of certainty, more like a mental sensation that may or may not be accurate. She describes this more, of course, when we talk. The book is now available on Amazon, and I link to it in the show notes at braininspired.co/podcast/74. And as you'll hear her mention at the end, it's most effective for her if you buy the book today, June 16th. It's a strategy on Amazon to help the book perform well and thus reach more people. This is a great way to support her efforts if you don't already support her podcast. Ginger's a force for good in the world, and in part, her book is a way to show people there are good reasons to be tolerant of others and tolerant of yourself. So this was a real treat for me to get to interview Ginger. And on behalf of her, I am wishing tolerance among all of you. Thanks for listening. Ginger, we just had a conversation leading up to the recording, and you asked me if I would prefer that you start off. And I realize you always start off because of your podcast hosting experience. You've been podcasting for 14 years now. Is that right?
Just about, yeah. I started in late 2006.
Yeah, so you host a brain science podcast, obviously. You host Books and Ideas, and then your most recent one is Graying Rainbows, about the challenges and experiences of coming out as you're getting older. And I have to tell you, half the time I get recommendations for the Brain Inspired podcast for a guest. I look up, and then immediately my podcast feed lights up with that name, and you're interviewing them on Brain Science. And Yuri Buzaki is just the latest example of this. So this is your most recent episode on Brain Science was this great interview, your second actually, with him about his latest book. So you've ruined another interview for me. So thanks, Ginger.
You're welcome, Paul. I didn't realize there was that much overlap. I imagined that you were interviewing, more on the artificial intelligence side of the spectrum.
Well, I kind of group it all together, and my background is neuroscience, so I tend toward the neuroscience side of things, and I want to bring in more AI people, but it's often heavy on the neuroscience, and then we talk about how AI is, in their world and influencing them, and how they think the brains can, their neuroscience work can influence AI. But it's all sort of in the same big boat, but a lot of my listeners are neuroscientists, so I imagine we have a lot of overlapping listeners. And so they recommend people like him. And now I just point to your podcast there, which they probably, I'm sure, are already listening to. So anyway, it was a great interview, and I really enjoyed it. And you continue to get really great guests. So congratulations, continuing on your on brain science.
Well, thanks so much, Paul, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to actually come on your show. I really enjoy being on other people's shows, although I don't do it very much. But I'm going to start trying to do it more now that I'm, releasing the second edition of my book. I really realize that I need to reach out to more podcasters and take advantage of those connections. So thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, I'm happy to have you on. Well, I actually want to start off. So we're going to talk mostly about your book that you just mentioned, Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty. But if it's okay, I kind of I'm really interested in your background, which I know a little bit about, but maybe we can dive just a little bit deeper because you have been an ER physician for a long time. And I guess you've, in the past couple of years, made the switch to palliative care. Why did you make the switch, first of all?
So actually, I've now been doing palliative care almost 6 years. Why did I make the switch? Partly because I have more of a palliative care personality than an ER personality. And also, ER is really a young person's field.
Why is that?
Well, it's, the hours are really hard. And, it's that's the main thing is that the hours are difficult.
Yeah.
You always have to work night shifts, and that is hard on the body.
Sure.
And probably the leading cause of death among ER doctors is car accidents on their way home from work.
Oh,
So,
being fatigued.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And falling asleep. So I really wanted to get out of the ER. And so when I didn't really know about palliative care because it's relatively new, and I found out about it from a friend who happens to be a psychologist. When I found out about it, I was like, this is, totally in my area of strength. I mean, palliative medicine is all about communication. It's about communicating with patients and families and helping them to make choices, mostly having to do with end-of-life issues, but not always.
Is it not always? That's what I was going to ask, is sort of give a broad picture of it.
Let's say you just got diagnosed with cancer. Well, this is actually a great time to start having an involvement with palliative care because you can start working on or asking yourself questions about, what's really important to you? How many, procedures or whatever do you really want to go through? What are your priorities? What makes life meaningful to you? What losses could you deal with and what losses would be unbearable?
I mean, the interesting thing is these are all questions we should always be asking ourselves
but
early in life.
I think everybody should be asking themselves these questions now with COVID-19. I mean, because I'm actually dealing with patients in this situation, I've, been through this on my own, and I've thought, I don't want to spend the last several weeks of my life on a ventilator. Right now, if you are on a ventilator, your chances of getting off are probably still less than 50%.
Mm-hmm.
So if I was faced with it at my age, which is almost 65, if I was faced with, I have COVID right now, my plan is I'm not even going to go to the hospital. I'm going to stay home with my golden retriever. Now, I might get to where that plan cannot be carried out. Like if I'm too short of breath to feed my golden retriever, then I will have to come up with a different plan. But,
right.
So, and unfortunately, like with this, we aren't talking to patients who are minimally symptomatic about what if. We aren't doing that. So what we're really doing is dealing with patients who are now on a ventilator and their families have to make decisions. And that's obviously less than ideal. But it is about communication. It's about making medicine, which is can be very complex, comprehensible, So in a way, it's a lot like podcasting for me. I mean, I think I got into podcasting about neuroscience. First, let me say this: I'm not a neuroscientist.
That's a beautiful thing.
I am not. Yeah. I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not even a neurologist. There's one podcaster who keeps calling me a neurosurgeon, which I'm not that either.
Take it.
But my background is in medicine and engineering. That gives me, because I have a master's degree in engineering, so I was in engineering before I went to medical school. So the combination of that and my medical background makes it possible for me to read books about neuroscience, and I might not get all the little deep technical things, but I can get enough to be able to translate that to the general public. And so that's the really rewarding thing for me, is helping other scientists make their ideas accessible to people of all different backgrounds. So you can see there's a big overlap between what I do as a physician, because I think my greatest strength is my ability to communicate.
And did you use that strength as well, as much when you were an ER physician? I mean, I guess you still have to be really
yes,
good at
actually, you would be surprised at how many times patients said to me, well, no one ever explained it to me like that before. Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, I'm glad that you found a new venue to that you've settled into, and that fits your makeup and lifestyle better with the palliative care. So that's good. So, I mean, you're a very busy person still. I mean, you have these 3 podcasts, you're writing books, and you're a full-on physician. And I guess you've not been exposed to COVID then, am I correct?
So far, I haven't. I mean, we, in Alabama, there are some hot spots, but things aren't too bad where I am. The University Hospital obviously has the most cases, and the VA hospital I work at is right next door to that, but we've never been overwhelmed yet. We have the patients, isolated so that we don't actually go into the room. I mean, they try to make sure that the people who, because of the need for extra protective equipment, the number of people who actually go in those rooms is pretty limited. The thing that makes our job really hard is that patients can't have visitors. In Alabama, the law is that only patients that can have visitors are people who are palliative care, which is my patients. So some of my patients can have visitors, but a lot of them that aren't, like if they're on one of those units, they can't have visitors, and we'll be having to talk to their families over the phone. And that makes things really difficult, because talking to people about these kinds of things and not being able to be with them face to face is, it makes it much harder.
Yeah. Interesting times.
Yeah.
The one other thing that I kind of would like to ask about before we get into the book is I wonder if you have, I know this is an unfair question, but I wonder if you have some favorite memories from brain science specifically from, all of these years. So the book, Are You Sure, comes from some of your kind of earlier interviews.
Yes.
And so, you've changed, the field has changed, but you've had lots of wonderful guests. And I just wonder if you have any, memories that kind of stick out as favorites.
Yeah, that's, at this point I've interviewed over 100 scientists. So, I have a few favorite guests like John Rady, who writes about the value of exercise to our brain. And actually, one reason why I picked the particular topic that I picked for Are You Sure is it's really based on the work of a retired neurologist named Robert Burton. And he is also a guest that I really connected with early on. And he's mentored me in several ways that I won't get into, but he's so humble. I mean, most of the people I interview are so humble and generous. That's one thing that stands out for me is how generous they are. And I find it really rewarding when a scientist or other guest tells me that they enjoyed the depth of my questions. Because mostly they get interviewed by people who haven't read what they wrote, and I'm sure that must get really frustrating. And then from the listener point of view, obviously it's the feedback from listeners that really keeps you going over the years. There's been a few times that I got really close to quitting, such as when I decided to do a fellowship, which entailed working twice as much and making half as much. But it's the listeners that keep me going when their feedback, when they write that the show changed their life. And I don't mean just like a listener who says, oh, I've decided to go into neuroscience, which is kind of amazing. But when somebody says, recently I got an email from someone who said that they had mild cognitive impairment, which is the first stages of dementia, and they said that listening to the show was helping them to cope. And I'm like, I don't actually understand how that works, but it makes me feel good to know that it does. People write to me about their coping with all kinds of different mental health challenges, and it's surprising in a good way that knowing more about how your brain works helps people to cope. So that's something I would have never anticipated. I mean, my original goal was I was just trying to offset the horrible coverage of neuroscience in mainstream media. But it's not just about getting the facts right. It's about helping people to understand how science is really done and the fact that it's done by human beings. I get emails from people who say, now I heard this scientist on there and now I understand, he's just a regular guy just like me. and they'll even go and read the people's books, that's really good too. When I first started, I thought, well, no one's reading these books, so I've got to get this information out here. People still buy the books too, and that's good for the people that are writing them for sure.
Yeah, I think one of the great things about your show is that normally you do focus on you interview someone who has sort of recently written a book, and usually that book is meant for a popular audience, but it might be just a few steps away from the layman, real general population, and you make this really smooth transition so that people can ease into it, and then they, when they do buy the book after listening to your conversation, it really opens up. It's a primer for the book, a really nice primer. So that's one real strength I think of your show that I really enjoy.
Well, that's one way that the show has really evolved, because when I first started. Actually, when I first started, I wasn't doing interviews, and I was covering the really, really general audience level books. And if I had stayed at that level, I probably would have died of boredom, right? Because there's only so many of those books you can read. And fortunately, I started to get great books from academic publishers. And so now I mostly actually read books that really are intended for academic audiences, although the authors always aspire to reach a broader audience. But, when you look at the footnotes and so forth, you see that that's not really how it works. And so actually you mentioned Dr. Busacki. When I did his book, Brain Rhythms, way back early on, I guess that was in the second year of my show, that was actually one of the first really difficult books I did. And I'm going to admit a secret, which is I interviewed him because I could not figure out how to explain his book on my own.
Oh, that's great.
And that was the first time that had ever happened to me. In fact, at that point, I had the habit, because the show was still coming out twice a month, I had the habit of I would do an overview, and then if I thought the topic was really important, I would have the person on for a second episode in which we would sort of fill in the gaps. And so there's a lot of early episodes that fit that pattern. And his was the first one that I did where I never tried to give an overview because it was just like I couldn't quite manage it.
I love that book, and you're right, it is pretty technical. I'd say his most recent book, The Brain from Inside Out, is much more accessible. But I'm also much more educated now, so I don't really know.
Right.
But he even goes to the pains of writing these really nice summaries at the end of every chapter, and he did in Rhythms of the Brain. And so I think he's really aspiring and doing a great job of it as well, to reach someone who is maybe a layman with a lot of dedication to learning, could really, this is kind of what and I don't mean to make this about me and my show. I usually interview people who have not written books, but who are like scientists who have, so I read 100 of their papers, and we get like down and dirty and nitty gritty. And so it is not really for the layman's layman audience. So I demand of my audience to just kind of like hang on and then use whatever we say to go and educate yourself beyond our conversation, and I always point them to the references and everything. So it's a very different way. So your way of doing this, of interviewing the people, and I love that you began your first actual interview right off the bat was just because you didn't feel confident enough to explain the concepts
no,
of the
let
book.
me correct. That was not my first interview. Gosh, at that point,
but
I had done quite a few interviews, but that was the first time I ever interviewed somebody without doing an episode about their book first. And that was good in its own way because it gave of course, then at that point, I didn't have a reputation. So having that episode where they could hear what I had said and know that I wasn't, that I'd done that work. And so they were more likely to come on. I mean, I interviewed Christoph Koch very early on. And I'm sure that having reviewed his book first was a reason why he agreed, because he was probably my first, well-known guest. I've sometimes toyed with whether it would make sense to go back and do it that way again, but I don't think I will. But doing a show, the thing about my show that's different from yours is that your target audience probably is neuroscientists. And I actually have quite a few neuroscientists listen to mine too, like you.
Yeah.
And so, the asset there is someone that everyone gets in a really narrow field. And then I get emails from neuroscientists who enjoy hearing about things outside their own field. So it doesn't hurt that the episode has come down to a little bit more general level, because even everyone in science knows that it is very hard to read the literature outside your own area.
Yeah, it has to be just, the tiniest bit outside of your own expertise, and you're done.
But then at the same time, I have the listeners who maybe didn't even go to college. So that's a big challenge, and it sort of goes against conventional wisdom about what you're supposed to do, right? And the usual way that this is coped with is that people assume that what they have to do is dumb everything down. I mean, that's one reason why science coverage is so bad. The other reason is that most of the people doing it aren't literate of science anymore. It's a very bad time to be a science journalist. So those things, you watch the average show about a science topic, and it's a bunch of special effects, but there's almost no real content, right?
Yeah. I mean, there are shows like, and we'll get off this topic, I promise, in a second, but there are shows like even Radiolab, which I actually cannot listen to anymore. But, if I did, I mean, I shouldn't say I cannot, but I just don't enjoy it because it's so much fluff and it's so geared toward the lowest common denominator. And they do an excellent job, and it's a great show, but it's just it appeals to this, the widest possible audience. And I don't know, yours is just like right in the right place. As always, I bow down to you, Dr. Ginger Campbell.
Well, I bow down to my listeners who give me feedback so that I know what works. And one of the things that I've learned is that the listeners who have less of a science background, they don't mind if they don't understand every little thing, as long as you make the key ideas clear. And most importantly, no one wants to feel talked down to. Okay? So you have to treat your audience with respect. And so defining things in a way that's respectful is, a part of it. I don't think that I really do that consciously because of my professional background, and then I always do summaries at the end, which is something that I do because of listener feedback. Yeah. If you went back and listened to my earliest episodes, those summaries weren't there because it wasn't until I think I did one and somebody said, yeah, I really, love that. And I got an email recently on that exact same topic. And I was like, yeah, this still, it works.
I'm gonna steal that from you. Okay.
Yeah. I think I don't know that I actually stole it, but when somebody told it to me, I was like, oh yeah. I started thinking about my favorite, I was still doing ER at the time. I started thinking about my favorite ER podcast, and I realized that the guy did that exact thing, and that the part of his show that I liked the best was at the end when he said, the bottom line is blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Well, this is a perfect segue because it made me think, all of our ideas are stolen from somewhere, whether we are conscious of it or not. Okay, so let's talk about your book, shall we?
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is the second edition that's being released, and this episode should be airing and I'll make sure that happens, and I'll talk about it in the introduction. But the episode should air the day that you can purchase it on Amazon. And so the book is called Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty. And you want to just start off by giving us a broad overview of what the book is about?
Absolutely. So this book explores the implication of one of the most surprising discoveries in recent neuroscience, which is the overwhelming evidence that most of what our brain does, maybe 95%, is unconscious. That doesn't just mean it's outside our conscious awareness. It means we can't even access it by introspection. And my book is really based on two books by neurologist Robert Burton, who I mentioned a few minutes ago. And the origins of the book are really that when I wrote the first edition, I was doing an experiment in Amazon book publishing back when that first became easily accessible. And I didn't have time to write something new. So I picked these two episodes from Dr. Burton about his first book because I thought that it was a really important idea. And when I got ready to write this second edition, I added in information from a follow-up interview I did with him a couple years later when he published a second book. So Dr. Burton's books are On Being Certain, Believing You Are Right Even When You're Not, and A Skeptic's Guide to the Mind, What Neuroscience Can and Cannot Tell Us About Ourselves.
When was the most recent one published?
2013.
13, okay.
So it was a book that was in this period when there were several books that came out basically say about the topic of neuromania, which is, trying to put everything on the brain and ignoring the rest of the person. So
I don't think I'd even heard of that.
There's
that
actually
term.
there's actually a book out called that.
Oh.
But anyway, the reason that I picked this, and especially this now doing this second edition, I'm actually planning to write a longer book that will, encompass more of the ideas that I've covered over the last 14 years. But I wanted to sort of master some of the working parts by doing this second edition. And so that's kind of the reason. And originally I was sort of like, oh, I'm just going to toss this out there. I'm not going to promote it. But then I realized it's going to take a lot of work to write this other book, and maybe it would be good if I actually did do some sharing of this book. But the reason that I picked this is because I think this idea of how much unconscious stuff our brains do is really, really important. It has a lot of implications. And in the case of Dr. Burton's first book, he focuses on one of those things, which is the feeling of certainty or the feeling of knowing, which is just a really accessible idea. And it's easy to see the implications of this. And so I just feel like if I was going to tell people one thing that I have learned in the last 15 years that I really want them to know, this is, really near the top. So that's really the reason for this particular topic.
So the book kind of goes through and explores a lot of different facets of what is generally referred to in the book as feeling of knowing. And I should just make the distinction that this is what you refer to as feeling of knowing, and I guess what Robert Burton refers to as feeling of knowing is different than what is used in the metacognitive and meta-memory literature called feeling of knowing judgments, where you are presented with you make a judgment about whether you'll be able to answer a question correctly without actually hearing the question. You only get the subject of the question. Like, do you think if I gave you any number of the planet relative to the sun that you'd be able to name that planet, right? And then you have to sort of access your familiarity with the knowledge that you have of the solar system, and then you could say, oh, I would be able to answer that, or I would not. And that's your feeling of knowing judgment. But what you're talking about is really a feeling of certainty, of confidence, correct?
Yeah, and they are interrelated. I mean,
Yeah.
I would say that what you described is an example of what I mean by the feeling of knowing, or what Dr. Burton means by the feeling of knowing, but it's not the whole thing, because he uses a lot of examples like I remember he was talking about trying to remember a character from a comic strip. And he said, I told my wife, I'm going to remember this in the morning. I'm going to go to sleep and I'm going to remember this in the morning. And he woke up and he remembered that it was some character from the old comic strip Pogo. So his point, and so he wakes up and he's like, okay, I know the answer now. His point was that both the answer and knowing the answer happened without his actual effort. And he goes on in his later work to talk about the fact that it's really hard to if you're awake and you're thinking, really hard to make a line between the conscious and unconscious thought, because we know that working memory is very limited, yet we can hold on to, the plot of a complicated TV show, right? Or a book or a conversation. Even though if you looked at working memory, you'd have to say, well, how can that all be in my consciousness? So that's when it gets really tricky and fuzzy. But where it gets, the bottom line comes down to, when you feel sure about something, that includes things you believe, like the biggest example really has to be if you believe in God or not. Because people who believe in God are really sure about it, and people who don't are really sure about it. Neither one of them can actually prove that they're right, but that doesn't change the fact that they're really sure about it. And the point is, if all of this is happening, and it appears to be happening in the unconscious parts of our brain, we don't control it. I don't control whether I believe in God or not. People think that they choose what they believe, but the evidence suggests otherwise.
By the way, this is a really good time to be talking to you. Good timing, because I'm pretty sure in the last episode, depending on what order these come out in, I had Megan Peters on, and she studies consciousness and more specifically metacognition and confidence, and how the brain encodes confidence as a complementary but separate process from decision making. So whenever you make a decision, confidence comes along for the ride, some level. So they're inseparable in that respect, but they are distinct in that your confidence can be incorrect relative to your decision. So you can have high confidence but make a poor decision, for instance.
Right, and probably what she calls confidence would be the same thing as what Dr. Burton means by the feeling of knowing.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know, if we could just step through a few of the topics that you cover in the book, and it won't be all of them, but and maybe you can just comment, on these facets. But maybe before that, just broadly, who's this book for? Is it for a general audience? Is it for, neuroscientists?
It definitely is for a general audience. I would consider neuroscientists to be part of the potential audience. It's basically for anyone who is curious about, how our brains make us the way we are, and what that means. I mean, to me, one of the reasons why I'm still doing a show about neuroscience all these years later is because I think neuroscience matters, and not just in the sense of facts, but in the sense of understanding ourselves and others. This is a very good example, because I think if people understood this, they might be able to consider being more tolerant, both to themselves and to other people. Obviously, tolerance is a disappearing skill right now. So,
do you agree with that? Is tolerance disappearing? Are we much more divided than ever? Is that true?
Well,
and we have no tolerance?
It certainly looks like it. We're much less willing to listen to the other person's point of view than we used to be.
I wonder why that is.
Yeah, I don't want to go down that rat hole, because then we won't talk about my book, and I'd rather talk about my book.
Yeah, there's none of the political aspects in your book, by the way.
No, absolutely no politics in my book.
no politics, but a plea for tolerance, which you make multiple times. One of the things you talk about in the book is how the feeling of knowing, and which Robert Burton elaborates on, is related to our sensation. Can you sort of tie the feeling of knowing into our sensation?
Okay, so he uses the phrase mental sensation, and this really appears mostly in his second book. And what he's really trying to get at is the fact that this is kind of perception-like. Okay, so when you become aware of something, right? Say you're looking at something and you see what you see. You have no awareness of any of the processing that happened before it entered your conscious awareness.
It just pops up.
It just pops up. And that means you can't control it either. So, for example, when you do a visual illusion or looking at a visual illusion, you can know it's a visual illusion, but you can't unsee the illusion, right? You still you still have the illusion, even though you know that it's an illusion. Okay, and so that's the way that we're trying to use this term to emphasize that we don't control it, really. And then another example of a mental sensation is agency. You feel as if you are moving your body. There's plenty of science that shows that that's dependent on timing. They can do things that make you feel like your body's moving without your control just by screwing up the timing of the signals reaching your brain. But either way, you don't control that either. So he uses that term sensation to illustrate the fact that it's perception-like, which means really not under our control. Now, I want to emphasize one thing that I don't think I made clear before, and that is when he uses the term feeling of knowing, it's really that sense that your thought is correct or true. So that sense isn't in itself a thought. That's where things get that's where the border gets gray and murky.
Right, because you kind of have a feeling that that God exists, or whatever example you want to use, that is ineffable. Essentially, you can't really extricate it from the content of what it's referring to. Does that make? Am I on the right track?
Yeah, and one thing we didn't mention was, well, why? Why would we even have this? Especially since it may or may not always be reliable. You would be paralyzed if you didn't. I mean, think about it. Real life involves making decisions all the time with incomplete knowledge. And you have to move forward. And in order to move forward, you have to have some sense that you're making the right choice. You have to feel like what you're going to do is going to work. You may not be absolutely certain, but you've got to feel some sense of certainty or you would be paralyzed. I remember my sister, when we went to college, my sister had this roommate who couldn't even decide if she would go to the movies, because her mother had always made all of her decisions.
Oh, geez.
And so she was like just paralyzed because she couldn't make decisions. And that's, probably the evolutionary origins of this whole, just like agency helps us to move our body successfully, this feeling of knowing, helps us move through a world that is really basically a little bit unpredictable.
So it's interesting, the idea of this feeling as a mental sensation. I mean, bringing it back to Bujaki again, whom you just had on the show, he sort of ascribes to the primacy of action, right? So on the one hand, there's the perception-action cycle, like our brains are there to perceive the world, and then we make decisions about those perceptions, and then we act on them. But he and others, for instance, Paul Chisek, who I've had on the show, they like to conceive of it as going the other way, that we take action in order to perceive. And in this way, and you guys mentioned Rudolfo Ginas on your show as well, whom I learned originally the idea of thought as being an internalized action. So you can talk about it from the mental sensation of perceiving your thought as if it's happening, but then you could also turn it the other way and talk about thought as an active movement internalized movement almost. And I'm wondering how that jibes with the idea of feeling of knowing. So in that respect, the feeling of knowing, you could conceive of it more from the active perspective and as an action. And I wonder how that jibes with the mental sensation aspect, which is the way that we actually experience it.
Yeah, I don't see any conflict there because one of the reasons why you have this feeling of knowing is based on experience. When something happens the way you expect it to, first of all, it seems to be innately rewarding in some way. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that, we work for those little dopamine surges, and one of those is successfully predicting what's going to happen, right? And I see the feeling of knowing as being very closely related.
Yeah, you talk about this in the book as well.
The whole idea of the predictive role of the brain. In fact, I'm reading a new book right now. It's actually called What is Health? And the author is talking about how the brain is allostatic, not homeostatic. And that means it's a predictive machine. It predicts, and he actually says the body is not, the homeostasis model is incomplete because the body really needs to predict what it's going to need ahead of time. Mm-hmm. And the brain is sort of really in charge of that, even if most of the stuff it's in charge of is not consciously controlled.
Yeah, I mean, the whole predictive coding and prediction in general is just huge in neuroscience right now. But homeostasis can still be at the base of that, though, because you're predicting in order to achieve homeostasis. But yeah, homeostasis wouldn't be the complete story about what the brain is doing. No one knows what the complete story about what the brain is doing.
True, absolutely.
But let's get back to this idea of the reward system being related and the learning system being related to the feeling of knowing, because you go into depth a little bit about that in the book. Can you just comment on that a little bit more?
Yeah, one of the things that Burton talks about is that feeling like stuff is rewarding, right? And there seem to be some people who, the know-it-alls, the people that always have to be right.
Yeah, are you talking about medical doctors, Ginger, or what?
Well, I'm sure that there's a high frequency of that personality trait. But yeah, it feels good to feel sure. It feels uncomfortable when you're not sure what to do, right?
Yeah.
It feels good to when you have something you're trying to figure out. It feels really good when you solve it and you feel like you've got it, right? So that's the prototypical reward. And he speculates on whether or not there might be people who might even be, in a sense, addicted to the feeling of knowing. They always have to be right, and everyone's got somebody like that in their life.
More than one. But so the actual reward, like the dopamine hits that's being delivered, how is it? So you have this feeling of knowing that kind of pops up into your mind, and then where does the actual reward come in?
Well, this is kind of a big picture view, so this is not a microcircuit view. Mm-hmm. I would think that the scientist you interviewed that was talking about confidence, you might narrow it down if they've got circuits that relate to that. I don't know. I don't think we're at the stage where we can really microanalyze it quite yet. This is more of a big picture approach.
So the central idea, though, is because your feeling of knowing can be proven demonstrably false to you, or you can, or it can be proven more along the correct line, right? So you make a decision, and you have the feeling that you're making the right decision. So you get rewarded if that feeling is corroborated, if that, yes, you seem to have made the right decision. But maybe with the know-it-alls, like you were saying, they get rewarded regardless of how accurate their feeling of knowing is.
Okay, so let's back up one. In this model, and let's just admit that it's a model, mm-hmm. The reward is not happening at the confirmation. The reward is happening at the point at which you have the confidence that you're right. Now, this brings up a topic that I think is really important to address, which is the issue of intuition. Because a few years ago, there were several books out that really popularized the notion that intuition is somehow, special and innately more accurate. And there's an overlap here because when a person has this feeling of knowing, that is, in a way, an example of an intuitive feeling, right? Mm-hmm. Because they may not be able to prove the thing, they feel it's right. If we just automatically assume every time we have a feeling that we know the answer, that we just assume because it feels right, it is right, that's where things start to go wrong.
Yeah, you can ask my mother about that. She's a good example.
Right. So, we obviously need to be able to do that in order to survive situations that require rapid action, like if you are not wanting to be eaten by something that might be a tiger, you can't stand there and figure out for sure that it is a tiger. You need to just assume you're right and run. So you can see the evolutionary reason for jumping to conclusions. Unfortunately, most of the time in the modern world, jumping to conclusions is not the most reliable way of making decisions. And so, sure, if you got this gut feeling that there's danger around you, you should pay attention to that. But if you've got this gut feeling that you should buy a certain car, maybe you need to actually look at a little bit more data first.
I guess that's one reason why there's such an industry in habit formation and decision-making these days. Concepts like if a lot of people, when they think I need to buy the new car or any decision like that, the next step is supposed to be, okay, now write that down and let it sit for 2 days. And then ask yourself in 2 days if that's still the right decision, instead of to impulsively act on that decision.
Yeah, but I think you also need to add, and this is not just from me, this comes from other neuroscientists too, that along with the not making a rash decision, maybe do sit down and write down the pros and cons. We do not need to throw rationality out the window just because it's not the only piece. I mean, one of the things that Burton really talks about a lot that I don't know that I really emphasize as much as I should is that the idea that there could be what he calls autonomous rationality, which is the ability to be just purely rational, is a myth because that's because of what we've been talking about.
Right. Right.
We got these unconscious processes telling us this is right. We can't really come to a truly rational decision, even when we think we do, because we're always going to have these pieces that we don't have access to that are influencing us. But depending on the situation, we can do better. We can balance that gut reaction with the facts as the best that we can determine what they are.
I mean, this really leads into a lot of what you discuss in the book is the difference between conscious and unconscious processing. And, one of the central ideas is that the feeling of knowing and thoughts and just about everything originates in the unconscious, if you could say something originates, and then, may or may not make it to the conscious processing. And you just talking about the difference between, whether we can be completely reasoning beings and how that's impossible. There's an interesting duality with conscious and unconscious processing because you start to wonder reading your book, well, is there any real difference between conscious and unconscious processing? For instance, when you're working on a problem and you tell yourself, I'm going to remember that tomorrow morning after my sleep. Or even when you get stuck on a difficult problem, the best thing you can do often is to let go of your focused thinking mode and go for a walk or take a shower. And then this is where these intuition books all came out, probably, because then you magically come up with the answer, right? And so maybe that's the origin of this popularity of intuition as being always correct or something.
Yeah, and one of the things that Burton also talks about is it feels different. I apologize for using the word feels, but I can't come up with a better word. Right. When you are working on, say, a math problem and you are consciously going through the steps, you have this sense of effort. When you sleep on it and you wake up, you have no sense of effort. That lack of sense of effort easily gets translated into magic. My muse did it. The God told me to do it, whatever. Yeah. Okay. But it really isn't different. It's just that you weren't paying attention. It'd be like you put a search term into Google and you don't sit there and, you can't see what it's doing. You're not going to sit there and it's just going to come back and it doesn't feel like you did anything because you didn't. And one of the terms that Burton actually uses is the idea of the hidden layer, which I think is a thing in AI. And really that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the layers that we can't get to. And I'd like to emphasize that this is not a subcortical versus cortical question, okay? Right. Because sometimes people have, well, you mean everything happens subcortically, and obviously that's not true, okay? Yeah. I was actually having a correspondence with Joseph Ledoux about this, and he was talking about some of the latest evidence about certainty coming from the prefrontal lobes. And I said, well, but that still doesn't tell you whether or not it's conscious.
And his response was?
He said, yeah, that's true.
Yeah, it's true. Right. That's good.
But I want to emphasize one other thing, Paul, and that's that, this whole word consciousness, one of the problems is that there's not a whole lot of agreement about what that word even means, right?
Right. Even in my last episode with Megan, we started off by defining it, and I'm sure she would agree that she and I had a shared knowledge of what we were both talking about, but I imagine it left a lot of listeners unsatisfied with the way that we defined it, because even when you define it, there is an agreement on what it is. Right.
And then so when you read different writers, like I did a series on consciousness last year, 4-episode series, and there was a diversity. Sometimes I feel like the people that are writing aren't necessarily writing about the same thing. Some of the conflict, I think, goes around the fact that they're using differing definitions. The image that comes to my mind is that famous one from Buddhism, the one where, the blind men are trying to describe an elephant, and each one of them, they're blindfolded and they're touching the elephant in different places. Uh-huh. And so they're giving different descriptions. And I think that that's happening, in neuroscience. To a certain extent, people are sometimes describing different things. So the main point I really want listeners to understand is it's not the words as much as the idea that there's stuff going on that you actually can't get to and you can't control it. That's the key idea. Whether you want to call it unconscious or you want to call it subconscious or you want to call it almost conscious, or I don't care what you want to call it. The idea is there are hidden layers.
Yeah.
That's the key.
Quasi-conscious. There you go.
Yeah. There are some writers who don't want to use the word unconscious because of its baggage from Freud.
Oh,
right?
Yeah, right.
So, but let's just admit that, he was wrong and move on. Okay. My ideas have evolved. Before I started, I was reading for about 3 years before I started my podcast. So when I first started reading neuroscience, I still sort of had the idea that, maybe there were some things the mind could do that weren't physical. But when I was a naive dualist, which is where most of us intuitively start.
Sure.
But when I read about the fact that you can stimulate a certain part of the temporal lobe and create an out-of-body experience, that was kind of the turning point for me, because I realized everything that I thought needed a non-physical mind to explain can be explained by the brain. So my basic thing is that the brain is essential to consciousness. I think embodiment is important, so I don't see the brain as being all there is, but I do think it's essential. And I recently read a book called The Spontaneous Brain, which actually proposes that we should abandon the term mind completely.
Oof.
Okay. That's a spoiler. You have to look forward to that episode to find out why.
Oh, good. Yeah. So you're going to interview the author?
I have already interviewed him, but I probably won't post it till July. So
yeah. Well, this is a problem. Words are a problem because, especially when they refer to things that are not well specified, like mind, like consciousness. And I know that there's a lot of great progress being made, and this, consciousness is the subjective experience type style of consciousness is why I got interested in neuroscience. And a lot of progress has been made, and yet we still feel far away. I feel far away personally from even being able to formulate the right question, to have a feeling of knowing that I am formulating a good question about consciousness, and that is frustrating to me.
Right, and that was the great thing about Busaki's new book, The Brain from the Inside Out, is that he proposes that we need to reevaluate the terms that we have inherited, from basically from psychology that
from
were
Aristotle
all,
even, yeah,
and even further back, that all predate any knowledge about what the brain is really doing. And this idea that we get rid of the term mind is actually a continuation. He didn't go that far, but I actually read The Spontaneous Brain. It's a couple years old, and I actually went back and read it after reading Busaki's book because I realized this, because, Busaki also talks about the spontaneous activity of the brain a lot in his new book.
Right.
And so it takes it a step, further. Yeah, and the thing I like about this idea of getting rid of the idea of the mind is because this author basically says the mind-body problem, it's just we get stuck.
Yeah.
He actually argues for something he calls the brain world problem instead, and he uses the analogy of Copernicus. When people thought the Earth was the center of the universe, they couldn't imagine their real place in the world. And as soon as if we think the mind is the center of everything, we are stuck with this problem we can't solve. We get rid of the mind and say, well, how does the brain interact with the world to create consciousness? That's the beginning of a question that maybe we can answer.
That's his take anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, words like these, like mind and consciousness, they just have such lofty, magical associations that I think that it's that people do often recoil and say, okay, let's just get rid of them. The other solution is just to redefine them in non-magical terms, like, the mind. That is what the brain does, or that is the process of brain processing is mind, something like that. So, but then there's always contention about redefining things, reoperationalizing things. But but it seems like a process of taking the magic away, which then also makes people unhappy because people like to think of consciousness and mind as magical. So I don't know. It's an ongoing problem, I suppose.
Yeah.
So so we've touched on multiple facets that you've covered in the book. The idea of the vast majority of our brain processing being unconscious, and this idea of the feeling of knowing originating in the unconscious, and then we just sense it essentially, and we're not in control of the vast majority of our and we don't have access to the vast majority of our brain processing. What else should the listeners know about the book?
Well, I'd like to give an example to give a better sense of this. This is the primary example in Burton's first book. It has to do with the famous Challenger study. Had you been familiar with that before?
I had not. I don't think I had.
So when the Challenger disaster occurred, at that time, there was an idea in psychology of this thing called Flashbulb Memories, the idea that when something really dramatic happens, you remember it very vividly and more accurately. So to test that theory, this psychologist interviewed about, I don't remember exactly how many students right after
hundreds, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was it was over 100, but I don't remember if it was over 200. But anyway, he interviewed these students right when at the time of the Challenger disaster, and he asked them to write down what they were doing and what they were feeling and so forth. Then 2 years later, he talked to them again, and he asked them to tell him the same thing. And the correspondence was really low. Only about 25% of them actually had memories that matched what they'd originally written.
Yeah.
And the thing that stuck out for me was there was one guy who looks at his own handwriting and says, well, I know that's what I wrote, but what I remember now is what really happened.
That's crazy.
But that is the reason I picked that example is that shows you how powerful this really is. I mean, when you are really, really sure about something, it can totally supplant any kind of logic. And this explains the reason why, or it's one of the reasons why, it is so hard to get people to change their minds about things using facts.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. In a sense, I mean, this is an adaptive process, but more so in the jungle, like you've said before. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Yeah, and you think about all the various cognitive biases that we have. Let's take, for example, availability bias, which is the one that is that when you hear about something, you're more likely to think it's likely to happen. Well, when you hear about something on TV, it doesn't really make it very likely to happen where you are, right? But if you were in the jungle with a small group of people, you would only hear about close-in events, right? You wouldn't be hearing about something happening on the other side of the world. So using, I just heard about this as a warning that something is possible would have made sense.
Right.
But it doesn't make sense anymore, especially given the fact that the news media always, magnifies the crazy stuff that happens.
So I think that this issue of our modern society and us modern humans, now that we're relaxed, most of us not in the jungle, and have plenty of leisure on our hands, this is the time when we most need to overcome our biases and most need to keep our feeling of knowing in check and maybe not trust as much, I'm not sure if that's the right way to put it, the unconscious processing that has been shaped and sharpened like a knife over evolutionary pressure and adaptation. And it's strange to think that moving forward, evolution happens so slowly, unless evolution has stopped for us, which is a completely separate topic. But it's strange to think that moving forward, we're always going to have these systems in place, perhaps to really check our natural tendency to go with our initial feeling of knowing. I mean, is that one of the reasons why you think it's so important that we understand that most of our brain processing happens at an unconscious level?
Yes, because it has a lot of implications, even beyond what we've talked today. Things like moral thinking is equally, there's plenty of evidence that people, when they give one of these thought experiments about a moral choice, they'll instantly answer, and then they explain, they rationalize whatever they said.
The feeling came first of what was right or wrong.
Yeah, exactly. So, knowing that, it's just kind of good to know that that's what our brain does. And that's why I talk about tolerance, because we can't, your first response could be to your own self. Well, we talked about how unreliable memory is, and from the Challenger disaster one, how many fights do we get into about stuff like that? And once you realize that, hey, everybody's going to misremember things, everybody's memory becomes embellished with time. That's just the way memory works. It shouldn't be the basis of fights.
It's weird because my wife misremembers things all the time, but I never do.
Yeah, my sister and I have we grew up together, but you wouldn't know it if we talked about what we did when we were kids.
Right,
yeah,
right.
I mean, it's really, it's pretty amazing actually. But that's a whole another topic. But it's based on partly the same thing. These processes that go on, the way memory works, is also not consciously controlled.
Yeah.
And so when we make a mistake, if I make a mistake, can I be tolerant of myself instead of having to self-justify and say I didn't make a mistake? Can I go, yeah, I made a mistake because, I was tired and I just jumped to a conclusion. And then the next time when somebody else does that, can I give them some slack? Yeah, he made a mistake. He was tired and he jumped to a conclusion. Or we all make bad choices and give both ourselves and other people, a little bit of slack. I'm not saying to justify doing things wrong. That's not what I mean. I'm not saying somebody who's just, murdered somebody should be off the hook. That's not what I'm saying. Please don't misunderstand me there. But those things don't happen out of nowhere either.
Yeah.
And I guess that means I should say one other thing about this. You alluded to at the very beginning, I think, the idea that, we learn how to do things and those things are now unconscious. Like once you learn how to drive, you don't have to think about it while you're doing it.
Right.
That's a little bit different from the things that are always unconscious, but the principle is still the same. So let's take our moral reasoning, which seems automatic, but it really isn't, because what we've really done is put everything we've learned, from our parents, from our culture, about right and wrong. We've learned that. A lot of it, we now know it in our unconscious. So it just feels, this is, and even things that don't matter. Like if you travel to another country, it could be something that's not even important. Like I went to Italy and I was like, why aren't there any shower curtains? There should be shower curtains. And because whatever you grew up with feels right.
Covering the body feels right.
We drive on the right side of the road. Why do those British people drive on the left side of the road? You can never run out of examples of things that we've internalized as feeling right because they're familiar.
Yeah, but the point that you make also is that, it is a two-way street. So we are constantly consolidating our experiences and putting that back into our unconscious on top of all the other experiences that we've learned in our lifetime and on top of the structure of our brains decreed by our genetics. And it's all in there in a big mix, but it's a two-way street, which is promising. And I love that. The main thing I love about the book and you're having written it is that you are writing it from a place of love, essentially. From, you want people to be better people. You want to help people be better people. And I don't know, is writing this book a way to give that call and also kind of show people why it is that we have this feeling of knowing, and therefore why it might be a good thing to consider that you can, change things and have more tolerance?
Yeah, and also as you just touched on the idea that I got sidetracked from, which is, the stuff we put in there matters. The stuff that we consciously ingest today is going to be in our unconscious tomorrow, not suppressed or anything in a Freudian sense, but it's going to influence what we do tomorrow. So that's another lesson, is we need to be selective about what information we're pouring into our brain. The old computer saying, garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah. I remember coming home from, I had roommates in college, and I came home one day, and one of my roommates, she was humming the McDonald's theme song tune, I'm Loving It. I think it was pretty new at the time, and I thought, oh man, we're all doomed. Because she was putting that right into her unconscious. And actually McDonald's had. So there you go. There's a good reason why they're so successful. Well, so, as we sort of wrap up, I'm wondering if, learning all about this, and specifically, the subjects in the book, the idea that most of what we do is unconscious in the brain, if it has changed your practice at work at all, in your day job.
Yeah, definitely. I have a better appreciation for the fact that other people see the world differently than I do. A better appreciation of the fact that because my patients' experiences are generally vastly different from mine, right, their perspectives are also vastly different. And I try to pay attention to and notice what goes on between the people around me in terms of, nonverbal communication. And I'm very aware of, and this happened early on, I'm very aware of the predictive nature of our brains. I mean, you just go, oh, that was a surprise. If you think about it, you go into a room and you instantly know if something's different.
Right.
And everybody just takes that for granted. But the other thing is just having that understanding that you can't change people's minds just by giving them the facts. And this is something that we deal with all the time in palliative care, just to come back to the beginning, because when people are making difficult decisions about, life-sustaining treatment options like should a loved one stay on a ventilator indefinitely, that is not a rational decision.
Yeah.
That is a decision about emotions. And so if you don't realize that, and we deal with this with the young doctors who are just learning, they think that if they just tell the family more facts, it will somehow make them change their mind. It never works.
Never. Mm.
And they don't, yet understand why, because they're barely young adults, most of them. And when they rotate on our service, which is unfortunately only like for 2 weeks, it's one of the lessons that we try to teach them is, recognizing when somebody asks you something, they may not even be asking you for facts. It's really coming from an emotional place. And if you go down a fact rabbit hole, it usually, so instead what we will do is something like, we'll ask the family to tell us about the person. What was this person like before they got on the ventilator? What did they enjoy doing? What was important to them? And then they start thinking about what the person's life is like. And, would this person want to be in this situation? Mm-hmm. That's not about facts per se. I mean, there's facts, but it's more about the emotion of, what I'm saying?
Yep.
So, and I think I had some instincts along these lines to beginning. As I mentioned, I think if palliative care had existed 40 years ago when I started medical school, I would have probably started out in that, but because it's my sort of comfort zone. It seems like a weird thing to say, but really, some of us are more comfortable talking about these things than others.
Yeah, I know hospice is different, but it's the same sort of thing that, people's, their makeup sort of helps them fit and be more comfortable in different areas, and there's nothing wrong with any of that.
Yeah, it's a good thing we don't all want to do the same thing.
That's right.
I always enjoy talking to the residents that rotate on my service. They're second-year medicine residents, and so I'm at a university where it's very, very academically oriented. So a majority of the residents go on to fellowships in subspecialties, and it's really interesting. I always ask them, well, what are you going to be when you grow up? And they know that question means, what specialty are you going to go into? And it always comes in little spats of, there's certain things that are really popular because we have really strong departments in those particular things. That tends to be a self-perpetuating cycle. But it's just interesting to listen to them and their reasons. I mean, they pick things that are all over the place.
Well, Ginger, what are you going to be when you grow up? Have you found it? Is this are you finally in the right place?
Yeah, I think so. I was actually on a podcast years ago, actually maybe the year before I went into my fellowship, and I talked about having been interested in many different things, and somebody wrote to that podcast, can't she decide what she wants to do?
Yeah.
I knew I wanted to be a cardiologist when I was 5 years old, and I'm thinking,
holy cow.
How could you have done that? I mean, it's much more normal for medical students a lot of medical students like every single rotation that they're on. So when they get done, they're not sure what they want to do. And of course, now we have a whole generation of people who know they're not going to do the same job their entire life.
Right. It's different. Different now.
So it's very different.
Before we go, so maybe that's sort of wrapping up our conversation about your book, Are You Sure?, which people should go to Amazon and buy today. But you're also, in the meantime, working on a newer project, which you mentioned earlier. And I don't know if it's a working title, but the title I know is Advice for Aspiring Scientists. So just tell me about that before I let you go.
Actually, Paul, I actually have several working
That's just one. Okay.
projects. And but I will tell you that one is really the idea of just basically, I always ask my guests about advice.
Yeah.
And so the idea of that one is just to sort of compile all that together into one book. The big project that I want to work on has a working title of Why Neuroscience Matters. Because this book, Are You Sure, touches on the theme of understanding how our brain works makes a difference to how we live our lives, or it can make a difference. And I think neuroscience has a special potential to be an entryway into science because it's naturally interesting to people. Almost everybody wants to understand their own behavior.
Right.
So a person who doesn't necessarily think they're interested in science might be attracted to neuroscience because they are wondering about, I think I see this from the people who come to my show because of mental health issues. So I want people to understand how science really works and that it's done by real people. This is, we see right now with COVID-19 how damaging science illiteracy is. So I would like people to have a better understanding of science in general as a method of figuring stuff out, and neuroscience in particular, because it's the one that, we can say, oh, this, and apply it into our everyday life.
One thing that's really interesting about that is that the term neuroscience and neuroscience as a field is so new relative to other sciences that it's interesting that you're thinking that it could be used as an entryway because the people who call themselves neuroscientists are often call themselves first some other type of scientist. It's often a physicist, right? And who gets interested in neuroscience because it's so new. People are still gravitating for it. So that's an interesting way to turn the tables and have people enter into science through neuroscience. It makes sense, though.
Yeah, and it's not because I want a bunch of people to decide to become neuroscientists. That's kind of like a side effect, right? When somebody listens to my show and they decide to go into neuroscience. What I really want people that aren't going to be scientists to understand what science is really, because the way it's taught now is so bad, people think it's just a bunch of boring facts. Or they think it's a bunch of boring opinions.
Yeah.
But they don't understand that it's always a work in progress.
That's the true nature. Yeah.
It's the only tool we have to overcome all these cognitive biases that we have basically wired into our brain.
Even though it's very flawed. Well, not even
it's
though
flawed
it's
because
flawed.
we're doing it. It's flawed because we're doing it.
Yep.
But so far, it's the best thing we've come up with. It's not the only thing, and that's something Dr. Burton is very good at emphasizing. And in fact, that's why his second book is called Skeptics Guide to the Mind, What the Neuroscience Can and Cannot Tell Us, because he actually started out as a fiction writer, and he really believes in the importance of the humanities also. So it's not that I would argue that our entire understanding of what it means to be human can be attained from neuroscience. That is not what I mean. But I think that there's things that it can help us. Literature is great at describing how people behave. Neuroscience can help us to understand why they behave that way.
It's like Winston Churchill's famous quote about democracy being the worst form of government except all others that have been tried. Yeah. So, my last question, why neuroscience matters. Are you going to attack it? So we were just talking about how logic and facts don't change people's minds, but are you going to attack it with logic and facts, or are you going to appeal to people's emotions?
Yeah, it's kind of a the facts are there. I think the indirect way to get to people's emotions is through stories. I mean, that's the reason why stories are so powerful.
Mm-hmm.
I have some stories I can remember from when I was a very tiny child. You know, the one with the train, you know, that was trying to get
train,
up the hill.
The little engine that could?
Yeah, that one. I mean, I've always remembered that. And I'm sure, I think I can. I'm sure that I remember that story because of the way it made me feel.
Right. Have you read that in a while? Because I had to read that to my children.
No, because I don't have any. I don't have any kids.
Yeah, it's not great. You should try reading it to your golden retriever one day and see how you feel about it these days.
But I still remember it. I mean, I remember the basic idea of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I never understood what a briar patch was, but I did get the idea that you wanted to trick people into doing things that you wanted that they thought that you didn't want.
Right.
But yeah, and I honestly think storytelling is my weakest area. So I am very grateful for the fact that there are other people who are much better at it than I am.
Well, Ginger, thanks for coming on my show. Continued luck, although you don't need any luck with your brain science podcast. And, you're graying rainbows and books and ideas and all of these new projects that you're working on. But mostly right now, good luck with the Are You Sure book. And people should just run out and buy it right now.
Yes, please do. Yeah, so I'm going to tell you the scientific reason why you need to buy it today.
Okay.
Because according to my writing coach, in the category of neuroscience, getting 200 sales in one day will make a bestseller.
And I'll give the more motivating reason. Think how it will make you feel knowing you have contributed to such a good cause. How about that?
Thank you, Paul.
All right. Thanks, Ginger. Brain Inspired is a production of me and you. I don't do advertisements. You can support the show through Patreon for a trifling amount and get access to the full versions of all the episodes, plus bonus episodes that focus more on the cultural side but still have science. Go to braininspired.co and find the red Patreon button there. To get in touch with me, email paul@braininspired.co. The music you hear is by The New Year. Find them at thenewyear.net. Thank you for your support. See you next time.